And our next question is titled, why doesn't this parse? In this question, I want to talk about the difference between human-oriented and machine-oriented tools. I want to talk about how to effectively use the command line, and I want to talk briefly about why the command line isn't typed, although we won't have an opportunity to go into that in too much depth or talk about really fancy things like typed streams, which is an area of my own interest, something that I'm very curious about how we would go about doing that effectively, but it's something that's a little bit too broad. Here's the thing. The command line is intended to serve two purposes. It's intended to be an ad hoc automation tool that you can use to just, write up something really simple to solve a task that's idiosyncratic to your use case, do it in 5 minutes, and then move on with your life. It's also written to be an interactive environment, and these two modalities of using the command line, the attended interactive, I'm sitting here writing commands, see what happens, then do something, see what happens, and the unattended, write a script, are sometimes at odds with each other. What you tend to see with command line programs is a fairly stark, and in the modern era, a much better developed dichotomy between those two modalities. In other words, if you have the free command, it tells you how much memory you have free. And I can't really read it in terms of bytes, so I'll do free-h. I'll see the human readable. I have 3.8 gigs of RAM, and I've got 2.3 available. Now, if I look for most programs of that nature, there's going to be a parallel way to get that same information. So a parallel way to get that same information is to look at the proc meminfo file in my proc file system. And one really interesting thing is, free comes from a library called procps, which is a bunch of libraries whose purpose is to read from that proc file system. I haven't looked at the source code of free, but I wouldn't be surprised if what free does is effectively reading this file and just pretty printing it to you. Well, think about this. There is fundamentally a distinction between human-readable, human-usable output and machine-readable, machine-usable output. For example, if you saw this output, and you could see there's some entities, and some of the entities are repeated, and there's some values that are repeated, this is kind of human readable and pretty easy for it to be machine readable. Clearly, the entities, the furthest left column, each column is space separated. I could write a parser for this in Python, maybe one comprehension, basically a line of code at most. I could even use csv.reader and get that for free. But if I wanted something that's a little bit more human readable, I think you could make a strong argument that this might be more human readable. Now, I don't want to litigate the exact specifics of how you might actually structure this to be more human readable, but maybe what's important is to see, when things are repeated. So maybe use ditto marks to indicate when something's repeated. Maybe when something's missing or not applicable, you just leave it blank. But whatever the case is, we can see that a lot of programs are orientated around human readability, like that free program. Because if I want to see how much free memory I have, interactively, I don't want to be skimming up and down this thing. I want to see it in a nice table. And I don't care if that table is hard to parse. It's easy for a human being to spot it. But it is definitely hard to parse, because do you really want to take the free output and grep for like the mem line and then do a read and just hope that somebody doesn't change the output of that program? And that's a very simple, very old program. Imagine a more recent program that might not be a program that is used by millions of people, but it's just written within one small part of your company or one small area of your industry. And imagine that it's constantly being changed. And do you really want to be chasing after every single small change? Oh, did it parse right? Did it parse wrong? Did I make an assumption correct? Are my assumptions incorrect? You don't want to, because it's a real pain in the butt. Instead, what you want to do is you want to leave those programs in place. Do not get rid of the programs in the world like free. They are very useful. They're useful for human beings to work interactively. But try to find what their partner programs are, or their partner approaches are. For every free, is there a cat proc meminfo? And to a large degree, there often is. Is there a robust way that is trivial to parse, that is stable, maybe even part of a kernel standard? Therefore, if it changes, a lot of people get angry and they write really nasty emails to mailing lists, and you could work with that. And so here's a simple program where I take, for example, the cat proc meminfo and I parse it. And free's not that hard to parse, but this is a lot easier to parse and a lot more robust. It is not always the case that those exist. There are a lot of programs, your LSPCI, your LSBLK, your DMID code, that may or may not have machine-friendly alternatives. These are all kind of human-friendly issuance. But what you'll often see, and what you should look at, if there isn't a clear duality is things like LSBLK that list your block devices does take the ability to customize its output. So here I can specify, give me the name and the path for everything that's mounted. And so instead of taking the raw output, at least say, give me only these two pieces of output and limit how many things I have to worry about when I parse it. Docker does something similar, although I think the Docker stuff's a little bit hokey, but you can pass a dash format, you can table format things, you can just raw format things, and the idea is you can build some simple shell scripts because you don't have to parse the human readable output, you just have to parse this output, and you can decide what that output's going to look like by formatting it. You can even do things like tell it to give you that output in some JSON-like or JSON equivalent format. What you will also find is things like LSBLK, and a lot of programs are now getting structured output in the form of JSON output. JSON is a convenient tool. It is not the best way to encode all of this data, and I'll prove it to you very easily. There's no datetime type, and datetimes show up everywhere. Do you really want to be turning, Unix timestamps into datetimes over and over and over? No, you want a real datetime type. And beyond that, there's so many types that are missing. But for very simple use cases, JSON is pretty useful and pretty convenient, and a lot of these programs will have output that you can then take and parse with tools like JQ instead of having to do string parsing. In the case of something like dig for looking up DNS addresses, what you can see is sometimes there's flags for shortening the output, getting just the one piece of data. And so instead of running one command and parsing that, just run each individual query. Like if you wanted the A records, the AA records, the A records, the AAA records, the CNAME records, do those independently and just have dig give you just that output. So it minimizes your parsing. If you can't get away from that, you will sometimes find tools or libraries of common parsers that people write. There's one here written in Python called JC that includes a parser for dig. It'll take the dig output and it'll parse it into JSON for you. And so at least you're not maintaining the parser, somebody else is maintaining the parser, and you can do something with that. You can use JQ again to extract the data you wanted to look at, but I'm somewhat skeptical about this, and I'll tell you why. You have your dig version, you have your JC version. They may not update in tandem. What if something changes to dig and your JC version didn't change in parallel? You can't really absolve yourself of that responsibility for the parser. You're really just minimizing that responsibility to at least keeping your JC library up to date. But in a pinch, it's not the end of the world, and it actually kind of works pretty well. But I think that there are some limitations for the robustness here, and I think that this is really your last option if the previous options don't work. Also, in general, JSON is convenient, but it does have its limitations.